So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this session. This is the last session of the 2025 edition of the Reconstructing Carnap webinar series, and today's speaker is Alan Richardson from the University of British Columbia. In his Reconstructing Carnap webinar, Professor Richardson will be offering his homage to his Dr. Vater, Michale Friedman. Alan Richardson is a highly esteemed scholar of Rudolf Carnap's philosophy and the philosophy of logical empiricism. During the talk, I suggest we can keep in mind that Alan Richardson is, I believe, the first philosopher to have written a monograph specifically on Carnap's Aufbau, namely his Carnap's construction of the word. And perhaps only Nelson Goodman did something comparably so focused. And today we will be hearing Alan speaking precisely on Carnap's early masterwork. Alan Richardson's contributions are very well known. He's one of the editors of the collected works of Rudolf Carnap by Oxford University Press. Let me then just mention his recent book on logical empiricism and scientific philosophy, and the volume co-edited by Adam Tuboli, Interpreting Carnap, both for Cambridge University Press. The title of Alan Richardson's contribution to the Reconstructing Carnap webinar series is On Looking for and Finding Epistemology in the Aufbau. Let me remind you of the format of our webinars. We have up to 1 hour for the talk, followed by a 5-minute break, and then other time for discussion. Overall, the session is supposed to last about 2 hours. So, Alan, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We are excited to attend your contribution to the Reconstructing Carnap webinar series. And from now on, please go ahead.
Thank you, Katerina. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. I feel like I'm giving a talk to my computer because I can't see any of you, so I'm looking forward to being able to see you all when I'm done presenting. Okay. Just behind me in my room is my bag, which is 95% packed, because an hour after we're done here today, I will be flying to Vienna, where I'll be happily participating in 2 workshops by members of the Vienna Circle Institute. So it's a big Carnap week. So thanks again to the organizers. As Katerina said, and as many of you know, perhaps all of you know, Michale Friedman, who is one of the very important figures in the recovery of logical empiricism as a philosophical project, died earlier this year on March 24th, as it happens. But yesterday evening at Stanford University, there was an event in honor of his life and work, and the life and work of his life partner and philosophical interlocutor, Graciela de Pierres. I was unable to attend, but I understand that was recorded, and maybe that we can all see that at some point. So our 2 philosophers here are Rudolf Carnap and Michale Friedman, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about Michale Friedman's Rudolf Carnap. And I will get, I hope, to everything I said that I was going to do in the abstract, at least to a little bit, but I ended up being quite interested in reading Michale Friedman the way Michale Friedman taught me how to read other philosophers. So there's a lot of stuff about how to read the entry point of Michael's interest in logical empiricism. So let me, without further ado, I think I've cleared my throat. Let me just begin. So, as I said, I do want to historicize Michael's interest in logical empiricism, why it became a central topic for him. So I'm going to bookend this talk by talking about, on the one hand, Michael's first book, the Foundations of Space-Time book. I'm not a philosopher of physics, so don't hold me to any philosophy of physics, but I am interested in Michale as a philosopher of physics and how that induced him to be interested in the history of philosophy. So that's one end of his career, so that actually the book comes out of his dissertation, but is importantly revised, and revised specifically by having a historical component. As he tells us in his 2019 John Dewey lecture at the American Philosophical Association, a lecture he gave in Vancouver in 2019, and is published by the APA. That was, in fact, the last time I saw Michael, because I had the privilege and honor of introducing him on the day. So let me just give you these two quotations from Friedman's his early work, and then his late reflection on his work. So here's Friedman in the Space-Time book. I shall show how the evolution of relativity reveals the methodological criteria that he's going to outline in action, allowing us to drive a wedge between good theoretical entities postulated by methodologically well-behaved theories and bad theoretical entities postulated by methodologically ill-behaved theories. Where the thing to think about, if you haven't read the book, is to think about Newtonian absolute space as a bad theoretical entity, because it has no way of being empirically determined. You can't figure out motion with respect to absolute space. And then almost at the end of his Dewey lecture, Friedman, now speaking as he came to do in his career in very much Kantian language, says this: the Kantian conception of schematism, on my new view, should be preserved in any successor of Newtonian mechanics involving a fundamental theory of force, motion, and interaction, together with the concept of the matter undergoing these interactions. All of these concepts, however abstract they may be in the pure mathematical part of our evolving mechanical theories, must still be analogously related to perceptual measurement procedures in any genuinely empirical such theory. The language here is, of course, somewhat different, and you can talk about the empirical import of theoretical entities without speaking Kantian language, but Friedman is clearly speaking Kantian language here. Whether the schematism actually does this is another question that we're not going to talk about. But it's important to see the ways in which there's a commonality of theme here involving the question of how is it that our best theories of nature are mathematical in form, and yet, unlike mathematics itself, retain empirical content, and thus can be evaluated on both empirical and methodological grounds. That seems to be the key philosophy of science question that animates Friedman throughout his career. And Friedman came increasingly, I think, to see, and already in 1983 maps out an argument to this effect, that the philosophers that he worked on as historical figures, Kant, the scientific neo-Kantians, especially Ernst Cassirer, the logical empiricist, Thomas Kuhn, were all working on these issues or very similar issues, and he, Michael, had to locate his views in a terrain that they had started to map out. And I want to say something about, in particular, about the way Friedman in the 1983 book offers up his first historical argument of what philosophical work it's doing for him. So the argument of the 1983 Space-Time book is precisely, as that quotation we gave a few minutes ago indicated, was precisely to argue for a form of realism about good theoretical structure. And thus, what he calls good theoretical structure, and thus it requires, as he says repeatedly in the first chapter, it requires that there is an observational theoretical distinction in place, even to locate its philosophical topics. So he's trying to reconstruct, he's trying to say what we need to do is think more seriously about the theoretical observational distinction and not just reject it, as seemed to be a movement in 1970s post-positivist philosophy. And this way of rehabilitating the theoretical observational distinction is in fact the point of the historical argument in the first chapter of the space-time book. Chapter 1 is a new chapter, it's not in the dissertation, and it's a historical argument that, to the effect that the logical empiricists constructed an observational theoretical distinction from a Kantian form-content distinction precisely by trying to figure out, philosophically, the methodological revolution of the revolutions in physics, especially the revolution involved in relativity. That's the argument of chapter 1. Thus, in doing this, Friedman locates the centrality of his own topic about what theoretical structures in space-time theories we ought to be realists about within a more nuanced account of what was at stake for the logical empiricists, and the figures he talks about most are Hans Reichenbach and Moritz Schlick, with a nod to Carnap, and we'll get to Carnap in a minute. On the observational theoretical distinction, so he wants to give an account of what they were up to in creating an observational theoretical distinction, while arguing, and this is his philosophical point, that they got the lessons importantly wrong, as did, according to Friedman, Einstein. As I said, I don't want to argue about the philosophy of physics, because I am unprepared to do that. But in order to see the force of this argument, of Friedman's argument, you have to view the logical empiricists as, in the first instance, philosophers of science, and in a radical sense. Only in and through working out the methodological lessons of the new physics could the logical empiricists even express their own philosophical views. So I argue. Do we have to read the argument in this 1983 book so strongly? To which I think I have the good textual grounds to say yes. Indeed you do. Here's a key passage from chapter 1 of the space-time book, where we get to the real meat of the issue. How did the empiricist arguments and tendencies of Leibniz and Poincaré, who he notes are neither of them empiricists, how did these empiricist arguments and tendencies of Leibniz and Poincaré contribute to the evolution of the philosophical movement we now call logical positivism or logical empiricism in the decade 1925 to 1935? My claim is that developments in mathematics and physics, especially the idea of general covariance, were absolutely decisive here. That is to say, they only are able to formulate their philosophical points by thinking about the developments in mathematics and physics. And it's those developments that they're trying to understand and that they're using to reorient philosophy. What does this mean? Well, the argument is that Reichenbach and Schlick's early work on space-time theories argue from, according to Friedman, from invariance under arbitrary bicontinuous transformations to factual empirical content, arriving at the conclusion that only local topological features of space-time are factual because only those are preserved under all admissible mappings. And I think, again, that there's a passage, which I'm not giving you the full sense of, on page 22 of the book, where he says exactly this, that the notion of factual content derives from invariance under arbitrary bicontinuous transformations. One might say that the factual, invariant versus theoretical, conventional or superadded distinction is only drawn precisely in the context of theories that have this structure according to the early logical empiricists, which is why then space-time theories become the crucial case of drawing the theoretical empirical distinction or observational distinction. So 2 points now from historicizing Michael Friedman. First, one of the key things that Friedman, not uniquely but importantly, did for our understanding of logical empiricism was to read the logical empiricists as not, in the first instance, not as logicians or semanticists or analytic philosophers or even empiricists, but as philosophers of the exact sciences. It's only through their reflections on the methodological lessons of the exact sciences that they were able to articulate their own philosophical point of view. Second, we can now see more than 40 years after Friedman presented that argument, and in large part, and largely because of Friedman's own work, that there's a lot of philosophical coherence to the argument in the first chapter of the 1983 book, and a lot of historical problems with the argument as an argument about these figures. And many of these problems center on the figure of Carnap. So now we can finally get to our main event here, which is Carnap. I think it's really important to see that in Friedman's early work, Carnap is an outlier. So again, let me begin. The first quotation here is just a sort of general account of what it is he's trying to argue. And then we'll see that Carnap is a sort of strange figure for him in 1983. 20th century positivism began as a neo-Kantian movement whose central preoccupation was not the observational theoretical distinction, but the form-content distinction. So Friedman. But then he has to clear his throat a bit about Carnap, who seems to be arguing in the wrong direction. Carnap, unlike Reichenbach and Schlick, bases his reinterpretation of the form-content distinction almost wholly on modern logic, which is, again, importantly distinct from what he's trying to say about Schlick and Reichenbach, because their notion of form comes from work in geometry and topology and not in logic. And then later he says, for Carnap, like Kant, the formal equals the objective. For Reichenbach, the formal equals the subjective. Reichenbach in 1920. You might wonder whether that's exactly true of Reichenbach, but we're not going to talk about that either. For those of us who may have come upon Michael later than 1983, there's something really interesting about this. Because it turns out when you look at the argument in chapter 1, and then you look at the bibliography of the book, the only thing in the bibliography, and the only work that Michael mentions by Carnap, is the Aufbau. He neither cites nor evinces any familiarity with any of Carnap's pre-Aufbau writings in 1983. There is, however, a resource, a separate stream now that enters into Friedman's career after he's done being a graduate student and he moves from Princeton to Harvard, which is the Drebenar and his friendship with Warren Goldfarb, and how Dreben and Goldfarb are focused on these founders of analytic philosophy, and in the pantheon of, in the Dreben world, the pantheon of early analytic figures are Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, Carnap, and Quine. So in that story, Carnap has the leading role among logical empiricists. That's not the case in Friedman's book. So there has to be, in any case, some sort of confrontation with Carnap, not least because once you start reading Carnap's pre-Aufbau works, everything becomes a lot more interesting and complicated. I think I have the year wrong on this, but he definitely said this to me as I was beginning to think about writing a dissertation on the Aufbau. Michael said in his office, this book, it's like an acid trip. So let's see what kind of acid trip it is. So, by the 1980s, after 1980, when the revisions of the a 1983 book were pretty much done, he becomes a Carnap scholar. And in particular, an early Carnap scholar, publishing two very important papers on the Aufbau, one in 1987 and one in 1992, both collected in the reevaluating, reappraising logical positivism. And becoming in particular immersed in the pre-Aufbau writings, and certainly by the mid-1980s, he was already working on a translation of Carnap's dissertation from 1920, Der Raum, which changes the view entirely. So today, my thesis from historicizing Friedman is, it is the philosophical framing from his early philosophy of physics that not only allows him to see the endorsed epistemological project actually in the Aufbau, the one about how we're going to guarantee the objectivity of knowledge by showing that knowledge is purely formal, that empirical knowledge is purely structural, but actually requires that he confront that project, because that project looks importantly to be operating on similar distinctions to what Friedman himself thinks he needs in order to do the work in philosophy of physics. So now let's think about Friedman as a scholar of Carnap and the centrality of the Aufbau in what he says about Carnap's project. So as I sort of gestured at, some aspects of Carnap's Aufbau's epistemology, the endorsed epistemology of section 16, and how it then gets itself worked out all the way through the elimination of the basic relation, in order to show that empirical knowledge is somehow purely structural, and that's how you guarantee objectivity. Some aspects of this are quite amenable to Friedman's account. That epistemology is expressed in the idea that the constitutional system with autopsychological basis shows how, despite starting in subjective experience, we achieve objective knowledge. And in this project of showing how objective knowledge is achieved, logical form plays the starring role. It is in virtue of being purely structural in a logical sense that the propositions of science are objectively knowable. The form content and objective-subjective distinctions drive the epistemological lessons of the Aufbau. But Carnap is now more of a historical problem for Friedman's 1983 story. This because his pre-Aufbau work is more similar to what Friedman says about Schlick and Reichenbach than the Aufbau is. The pre-Aufbau story does not equate the formal with the subjective because conventional. Oh, so this is not a similarity, but it's also a continuing distinction between the pre-Aufbau story and the story that Friedman wants to tell about Reichenbach and Schlick. In the pre-Aufbau story, we don't get the formal is the subjective because conventional, which is what Friedman wants to say about Schlick and Reichenbach. Nor does the formal equal the objective. Rather, a la Kant, the fundamental epistemological gesture in the pre-Aufbau works is to find levels of structure. There is a necessary structure for there to be matters of fact of experience at all, which in Der Raum is local topological structure. And then there's additional structure, metrical structure, the metrical structure of the entirety of space-time required for there to be mathematically precise and predictive sciences of the factual. So here's what I want to say then, on the basis of all this. Friedman is right that various distinctions were important to the logical empiricists, and certainly to Carnap's projects over the course of these years. The form-content distinction, the objective-subjective distinction, the theoretical-observational distinction, the conventional-factional distinction, and so on. And these distinctions are related in each of their works in various different complicated ways. But the form-content distinction didn't just get transformed into the theoretical observational or the conventional factual distinction. Everything's more complicated than that. So, what is then Friedman trying to do when he actually writes the papers about the Aufbau in 87 and 92? So, interestingly, disappointingly, and no doubt for some readers, what Friedman does when he begins to become intensely familiar with Carnap's early work was to deepen and to reorient his claim that Kantian elements were important to the development of logical empiricism. The first move is perhaps the crucial one, if you're trying to understand Carnap, certainly. He continued to be interested in the relativized a priori, that notion from Reichenbach's 1920 book, that in 1983 was used in order to indicate ways in which you might think of the formal as the conventional and therefore the subjective. But now to switch from emphasizing its conventional and thus changing chosen or subjective side, and emphasize now its transcendental function, the way in which the relativized a priori works within any space-time theory to serve as constituting the object of knowledge for that theory. Second, Friedman emphasized how Carnap himself expresses the epistemological point of the constitutional system, not as reduction to the given because the given is epistemologically privileged, that is, because it's certain, because it's private and subjective, it's directly available to the individual knower, but because the given is epistemologically first, which he thinks all epistemological schools agree on, but epistemologically problematic because it's private and subjective. And the logical form of the given is going to solve the problem of the subjectivity of the given and show how we achieve objectivity anyway. The third move is to emphasize, as I've already gestured at, the epistemological neutrality that Carnap says this has. That he isn't in saying the given is or experience is epistemologically first. He's not. He says, and he seems to believe, that he's not thereby already committing himself to empiricism. Rather, every epistemological school agrees about that. And also, so there's the sort of epistemological neutrality allegedly embedded in how the autopsychological system is chosen. But there's also this larger point, which is the constitution theory, which is illustrated in the construction of the audio psychological system, has lots of scientific work it can do in philosophy that goes beyond or is different from epistemology at all. So we could do all sorts of interesting things philosophically with a constitution system on a physical basis. It's just that he's not illustrating that in the Aufbau. But he illustrates some of that in his other work. The fourth move that Michael makes is to note the peculiarity that somehow even empirical knowledge ends up being purely formal or structural. And the failure in the elimination of the basic relation RS of Carnap's most explicit attempt in the Aufbau to fulfill the explicit epistemological project. There are technical reasons why eliminating the basic relation in the way that Carnap does in those sections in the 150s isn't going to work because of the availability of, because it's going to work for any relation that has the same structure, which is why then Carnap introduces, in a way that seems like the ultimate fudge, foundedness as itself a logical notion, even though the foundedness is what's going to ground the epistemological availability of specifically this relation with this structure, namely RS, and not any other relation that has that structure. The whole thing is weird and seems like it doesn't work, not least because in order to do the epistemology, you have to bring in an otherwise hitherto unknown logical notion, namely foundedness. And the fifth move, then, is to claim that the philosophical sensibilities behind the Aufbau project, pro-scientific, anti-metaphysical, committed to a form-content distinction and the objectifying role of logical form, a commitment to forms of tolerance and conventionalism in the methodological sense, find greater expression in the project of logical syntax than in the Aufbau itself. So here's a very characteristic way in which Friedman closes, in fact, both of these papers, but this quotation is from the 1987 paper. The anti-metaphysical dream of Vienna finally stands or falls, therefore, not with phenomenalism, radical empiricism, or the verifiability principle, but rather with the remarkable program of logical syntax itself. And this program, in turn, is best seen as a continuation and a development of the earlier and equally remarkable program of Der logische Aufbau der Welt. So there's got to be a story here that somehow the sensibilities that are at play in what Carnap is doing in the Aufbau live on in and found more adequate expression in the program of logical syntax. All right, so that's a rush through important aspects of Friedman's historical claims about Carnap. And I've given myself plenty of time, but I don't think I'm going to take an entire hour to do this. I want to talk about some of the things that follow on from this. So I want to talk about the transition to the logic of science from epistemology in Carnap, and therefore say something about my own work, which Katerina was nice enough to mention earlier. I want to say something about Thomas Uebel's talk in this series, which I missed because I forgot that it was happening, but I have seen the slides, so I might have gotten the problem wrong, but I want to say something about Thomas's worries about there being a moment after the Aufbau when Carnap really does seem to be endorsing a foundationalist epistemology. And then I want to say something about Fred Beiser's provocation in his recent book on German positivism about Michael's overall story. So here's my second Friedmanism, this in between sessions at the Munich conference on influences on the Aufbau in 2017. You know, a lot of people cite your book, but very few of them seem actually to have read it. He wasn't talking about the people in the room. What's going on? So what I have in my sketch of Michael's work on the Aufbau, I've gestured at the ways in which what Friedman says is that somehow the philosophical sensibilities that Carnap is from early on expressing find a more adequate expression in the project of logical syntax, and that stems from Carnap's own sense of the failure of the Aufbau. And I guess in order just to talk about myself briefly, because I know my own work pretty well, this gave me my entry point as Michael Friedman's student in the late 80s to think about what it would be, what's going, how to write a dissertation and then a book on the Aufbau, exactly by thinking about in what sense, from Carnap's point of view, the Aufbau fails, and doesn't just fail in the detail, but it sort of shows the failure of epistemology as a whole. So by his own account, Carnap is doing epistemology in the Aufbau, and is not doing epistemology, but rather a successor project to epistemology called the logic of science, or the logic of scientific language, in logical syntax. And the project then, the the historical reconstructive project with respect to logical syntax then is to think about all of the changes that occur between the Aufbau and the enunciation of the mature syntax project, or maybe even the semantics project. And the main sort of interpretative issue is getting these changes in the right order of philosophical priority in Carnap's work. What's really driving these changes for him? So what this really excellent book, Carnap's Construction of the World, is about how what Carnap seems really to have come to understand after the Aufbau, as he becomes much more attuned to work in logic than he actually was when he wrote the Aufbau. There's all this sort of funny stuff about logic where he mixes together stuff from Frege and Russell and Wittgenstein as if it all makes sense together. Once he sees that he's got to be more careful, then I think what the key moment is understanding that the epistemological vocabulary of the Aufbau in terms of the objective and the subjective cannot be unequivocally, reconciled with the transcendental function of logic and the use of type theory as logic. And that Carnap's response to this, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, and Carnap's response to this was to say that the epistemological vocabulary itself doesn't make any sense, and that we just have to jettison that. We can't make sense of that from a logical point of view, and we have to do something else. So what the book is really about, or what you can think about going on in the Aufbau, is this. So logical form is supposed to come in and rescue objectivity of knowledge. The official version of that is that we're going to show at the end of the day somehow that the claims of empirical science are themselves purely formal. We've already talked about ways in which Friedman argues, and it seems that Carnap is even aware of this in the text of the Aufbau itself, that the official moment in which he does this, with the elimination of the basic relation, doesn't work. It's a fudge. There are other places where you might think that you've already done what Carnap said epistemology had to do. You might think that the constitutional system itself is all you need to do, because the constitutional system, and there is language like this in the Aufbau, the constitutional system reconstructs a intuitive experiential process as a purely logical thing. You might think, all I have to do is display the constitutional system with autopsychological basis, and I've shown the objectivity of knowledge. I think there are moments when Carnap actually thinks that. There are also moments when Carnap thinks that the objectivity of knowledge has been solved in the projection of the quality spaces onto space-time points, because the form of space-time is itself purely mathematical. All you have to do is show that now we have a common space-time world for all of the epistemological subjects, and we're done. I think sometimes Carnap thinks that. I think sometimes Carnap thinks that the construction of the intersubjective world solves the objectivity of knowledge problem. Which is to say, I think there are a lot of different ways that Carnap's thinking about what objectivity is and how it relates to subjectivity. There's a lot of different ways in which he's thinking about what form is. It is true that the official starring role for form is logic, but he has in the background of all of this mathematical notions of form, like topology, in his own work. So I think there's a lot going on, and as I say, really the problem is to think about how Carnap is, in his relation with and in interaction with other philosophers, trying to work out his own philosophical sensibilities. So let me just say a few things about Thomas Uebel's recent finding of this, I believe, November 1929 Polish version of, given in Poland version of the Elimination of Metaphysics paper, which Uebel quite rightly thinks shows a greater degree of commitment to epistemological foundationalism than Friedman would want, and that even seems to be there in the Aufbau. I haven't actually read the draft that Uebel's talking about, so this is at second intention, and it's going to be the cheerful Carnapian, Friedmaniac response. So here's something I think we can grant. Friedman sometimes made claims that are more clear and explicit, that there was more clear and explicit distance from empiricist, phenomenalist foundationalism in early Carnap than is strictly in the texts. There is a lot of reconstruction going on. But is the Polish draft of the Überwindung a smoking gun with respect to foundationalism, or a warm gun, or maybe no gun at all? So I think, here's what I think. I think this is what Friedman would say, and I think this is what I would say. I think we should be fairly sanguine here. That is to say, during his time in Vienna, Carnap was adapting his views to those in interaction with those in the circle, and the Wittgensteinian Schlickian influence is indeed very strong. And in particular, so this is one of the passages that Uebel cites from this draft of the Überwindung. And then we need to think about what philosophically is going on here. Every definition, so this is Carnap, every definition must finally lead to basic words. The basic words must only refer to the immediately given, the experienced contents. If the conditions mentioned are satisfied for a word, then every sentence can be translated into a sentence about this given, thus is verifiable and thus has sense. So there's this as a sort of epistemological claim, and then there's the other really interesting things that Uebel talks about, which is the attempt now to understand logic not as type theory, as in the Aufbau, but as an attempt to understand something about what the Tractatus is saying about logic, and to use Tractarian logic to understand how to make logical sense of epistemological claims like this. One thing I think to be said here about the epistemological vocabulary, yes, we've certainly got verifiability and we've got the notion of sense here, and reduction to the translation to the given and so on. But nevertheless, if you think, it depends on what we mean by, this is Carnapian move, what do we mean by foundationalism? There doesn't seem, even in this sort of passage, there doesn't seem to be a notion that we're doing this because, and this is important, because experienced contents are the bedrock of knowledge or certain or are indubitable. Indeed, the language used deploys mainly the form-content distinction. We might still be worried about how knowledge gets content. One might even say that one main theme in Vienna, and certainly in the Schlick-Weissmann camp, was to think that the logic was not type theory, as it was in the Aufbau, but whatever the Tractatus was saying about logic. So it isn't at all surprising that Carnap, during his universalist period, when he's still thinking in terms of the logic, if we know what the logic is, we'll know how the logic plays its objectifying role, might try to work that out. And this is going to look even more verificationist than the Aufbau when one tries that, because precisely of the restrictions on making sense of logic and Tractarian concerns that type theory sort of goes beyond the expressibility of what really is the logic. There's lots going on in the Tractatus. Maybe we're going to have to talk about that in in the question and answer period. But again, I'm not really I find it hard to remain up on the details of what's going on in the Tractatus. I've understood each sentence of the Tractatus, but I've never understood all of them. Here is, I think, for me, we often talk about Carnap's intellectual autobiography in the Carnap Mafia because we're worried about, as Thomas was the other week, ways in which Carnap seems to misrepresent his own work. But here's a passage from Carnap's intellectual autobiography that I think it gives me hope that Carnap is who I think he is. So here's Carnap from the intellectual autobiography talking about the loosening of verification principles through the course of the development of logical empiricism. Looking back at this, the verifiability principle, from our present position, I must admit that strict verificationism was difficult to reconcile with certain other conceptions we had at the time, especially in the methodology of science. Therefore, the development and clarification of our methodological views led inevitably to an abandonment of the rigid frame of our theory of knowledge. That seems to get things in the direction that I want them to be, namely that epistemology was always secondary to the logic of science for Carnap. That is to say, if getting straight on the methodology of science meant that verificationism wasn't right, then that meant that verificationism wasn't right. In this sense, we begin with the fact of science, to speak as a Marburg neo-Kantian. I'm sure that Thomas will have things to say, because that was all very quick. So let me just finish with Beiser's recent book and the provocation in it. So Fred Beiser's new book from the end of last year, Early German Positivism, is dedicated to Friedman, but Friedman gets rather a rough ride in the early pages of it. Friedman is said to treat logical positivism, quote, in abstraction from the developments of the 19th century, a view called terribly short-sighted. Of course, what Beiser means here is not all of the developments in the 19th century, but rather the developments within German positivism in the 19th century. And here's the main objection, as given on pages 7 and 8. Friedman maintains that the logical positivists rejected the synthetic a priori because it was incompatible with recent work in the exact sciences, specifically Hilbert's axiomatization of Euclidean geometry and the development of non-Euclidean geometries, which showed that spatial intuition plays no role in our knowledge of geometry, and more. Friedman's account is not the whole story. However, because the positivist rejection of the synthetic a priori came before these scientific developments, it had nothing to do with them, but everything to do with the rejection of dogmatism implicit in the synthetic a priori. So I'm going to give two responses now to Beiser, and then I'm done. So first, let us grant that Friedman's account is not the whole story. I think that we have to say that, and that there were 19th century positivists, German positivists and others, who rejected the Kantian synthetic a priori for reasons wholly different from the ones that Friedman claims motivated Schlick, Carnap, and Reichenbach. These concessions, of course, do not mean that Friedman's account is importantly wrong about Schlick, Carnap, and Reichenbach. Indeed, beyond Mach and Avenarius, whose role in the genesis of logical empiricism is pretty much universally acknowledged, although often strongly argued about, it is hard to find any reference to the work of the people Beiser's book is about, Las, Jodl, Düring, in the early work of Schlick, Carnap, and Reichenbach. So it's not clear that getting clear on how those people rejected the synthetic a priori is going to help you understand what's going on in Schlick, Carnap, and Reichenbach. But, of course, it's possible to be indebted to or influenced by schools of thought you do not cite, or even maybe even explicitly don't even explicitly have in consciousness. And certainly Reichenbach and Carnap would seem likely to agree that the Kantian synthetic a priori in its strict Kantian form, as necessary and universal and permanent and the conditions of objectivity, is the very core of conservative ideology. Certainly, I think Reichenbach would happily subscribe to that from the very beginning. So one might think that being disposed to look for alternatives to the synthetic a priori is itself a positivist attitude, one that we might inquire where it arises from for any figure in philosophy. I'm sorry, one that we might inquire as to where, for any figure in philosophy, they got the attitude from. And maybe in that story, there's, without saying too many things that would make Neurotians nervous about zeitgeist, nevertheless, there are clearly intellectual currents that go beyond what people have firmly in mind when they do philosophy. But this seems like it's largely a biographical question. Like now we have a question of where did Carnap's original attitudes come from, or where did Reichenbach's original attitudes come from? It's hard to know, other than as a biographical question, how to answer that question. But with respect to Carnap and Reichenbach, they seem, when they're asked to speak to their own philosophical attitudes, their animating philosophical worries, they cite their scientific training, specifically on these issues in the exact sciences, and their early social circles rather than a German philosophical positivist tradition. Indeed, Carnap's view circa 1924 in the Axiom of Simplicity and Task of Physics paper was basically, you might wish to be rid of the synthetic a priori, but if you want a scientific epistemology capable of dealing with the exact sciences themselves, you needed to wait for the methodological lessons of Poincaré and Einstein to do that. So whatever your attitude, you can't get a sort of fully formed, precise, empiricist, if you want to call it that, philosophy, although he doesn't call it that in 1924, or any form of scientific epistemology capable of dealing with the exact sciences until you get to the methodological lessons of Poincaré and Einstein. Or, to cite just this one last quotation from 1983 in Friedman, empiricist arguments and empiricist currents of thought are not the same as empiricist philosophy. That's Friedman in 1983, but I think you can read this from a Carnapian point of view to say, yes, of course, we all begin our philosophy with some sort of attitudes that come from somewhere, we know not where, but we don't actually achieve an empiricist philosophy until we achieve the logical syntax of science. And we don't achieve that except in and through the methodological lessons of the new physics. And with that, I am done. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, Alan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we have a 5-minute break, and then we are here again for the Q&A. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So we meet at 35.
I'm going to take a break.
So I think we are ready to start the Q&A session. So if there are questions, please raise the virtual hand and I will, okay, great. I also have a question. So first, obviously, Thomas Uebel. Yes, we are hearing you.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Alan, for your talk. I mean, there's a lot of material there. And I think it's probably fair to say that we agree about a fair amount. Particular thanks, so I should say, for actually responding to my concerns about Carnap, etc., and very much in the spirit of Michael. In fact, I could add that I very much, very vividly remember discussing similar things. Not obviously not the Warsaw object, but there are bits in what is it, old and new logic, etc., which are sort of ambiguous. I very much sort of just remember discussing that with Michael, and then too he was very steadfast to basically say, as you did too, look, what Carnap is doing there is he responds to the views in the Vienna circle, sort of around him, kind of stuff. So that's yeah. So that's good. So you're kind of extending, as I understand you're extending that line of response. Now, before I get to that, I want to say one thing, just in case, just to clarify. I'm not totally sure what your view of my view is. So let me just sort of say that it wasn't my view that that the Aufbau wasn't foundationalist at all. I basically, in my talk, I basically granted the Friedman, Richardson, Kreis interpretation of the Aufbau, and sort of say, nevertheless, there are these peculiar things in his autobiography, etc., and what do we do with it? That said, of course, there is this funny paragraph 180, which you also referred to and put it, well, actually, we can do that sort of thing. So, okay, so that's that. Now, then the question is, what happened to Carnap, or what was he up to in some of those dark years between 28 and stuff? I mean, one thing, for example, but I won't. Okay, I won't get back into my talk. Just two things with regard to your response. As I understand you, you're kind of saying, well, he's exploring, Carnap is exploring, well, what? Different ways of using logic to conceive of our conceptual structure, something like that. I'm not quite sure. With regard, I have what as it were moved me as I was working through these sort of little known texts and archive materials. Carnap was evidently concerned to see what makes it possible for strict verificationism to be upheld. And there, my question is, why on earth would one be interested in strict verificationism? Right? He doesn't have to, in my mind, you don't have to mention certainty if you're talking in that context. If you're talking about strict verificationism, it seems to me you've got foundationalism on a plate, to put it very crudely, right? And so that was one thing. And the other thing was that I saw him. They're very much struggling, and that is particular in this paper, Neue Grundlegung der Logik, kind of, and not paper. Sorry, that's rather obscure shorthand notes he has there. He was obviously struggling with the Tractatus, and he was struggling with the Tractatus in a way that took basic assumptions of the Tractatus for granted. It didn't question them. So, for instance, he took it he took it, well, I don't know whether he took it to be self-evident, but he took it for granted there, in any case, that singular propositions were the only genuine propositions. And again, and that of course ties in with this strict verificationism, and thus I was prompted, why on earth would he want to do that? So I was tempted to think, well, then, you know, he went, for whatever reason, I didn't get much beyond saying, look, there are these materials, and they seem to suggest that when we look back at the autobiography, that in fact there is more to be said that Carnap did not tell us. And okay, so that's my response. And anyway, thank you very much for extending the conversation with Michael in the way you did.
Well, thank you, Thomas. And I think we understand each other. I mean, you're obviously more familiar with the material than I am, and I'm willing to just take for granted that you're telling me things that I need to attend to. I guess, I mean, one thing that is true, if we remember, because I see Rick is next to you on my screen. One thing that is true is that Carnap, so two things I want to say. One thing that's true is that Carnap often, always, perhaps, has a sort of engineering mindset. Like, if somebody is interested in being a verificationist, one of the things you can do as a philosophical engineer is figure out if that's a sensible position. So, you know, here's a position that here's a claim that people are making. What does this claim actually amount to? And, you know, because we already know this from work by Greg Frost Arnold and others on Carnap's year in Harvard, when he's doing stuff that he actually isn't committed to, but you know, there are Harvard logicians who are interested in the calculus of individuals. Let's look at how that works, because that's just a logical problem. On the other hand, what I think is more important, perhaps, with respect to the documents that you've found, is trying to figure out exactly the influence of Wittgenstein at this moment on Carnap. Right. So the story I was trying to tell was a sort of bland story in my few minutes of remarks on what you were talking about the other week, sort of bland story that said Carnap has come to be at least willing to consider that something like the Tractarian delimitation of logic, not type theory, is what you have to work with if you want to do logic. That's what logical form is. And there are ways in which, you know, what the Tractatus says about logic are unclear, and what the but it certainly seems to be a weaker system. It seems to require maybe something like the sort of molecularism that you're talking about. So in your talk, you know, we're going to consider that this might be the logic, and then we need to think of what we can do if this is the logic, right? And what makes it less bland, if we embed it into the whole story of the conversations within the circle about Wittgenstein, is this curious way that I really don't understand, in which a lot of the members of the circle are reading the Tractatus as itself epistemological, right? So are we taking the logic from the Tractatus? Are we taking the alleged epistemology of the Tractatus? What are we doing? Are we clear about what it is we're doing? And are we doing different things if we're different people? So I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about in coming days across the ocean, but that's my initial response.
Thomas, you are muted. You are muted, Thomas.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you, Alan. I won't say much, as you say. We'll have chance to discuss it. But it's precisely that Carnap may have been just exploring these matters. In fact, it's one of the interpretive possibility I mentioned at the end. But what speaks against that is that certainly in that Warsaw lecture of November 1930. It simply affirms without any qualification that all deduction, all inference, in fact, alles schließen, all inference is tautological. There's no tentativeness about it, and that's what kind of freaked me out in the first place. But thank you very much. I'm sure there's been lots of other questions.
Vic?
First is to get the muting off. Can you hear me? Thanks.
Yes.
That was wonderful, Alan. I loved it. I don't think I disagreed with anything you said, and you said a lot. So that's an achievement. I once heard Quine say, I didn't disagree with anything you said, but you knew that the subtext was that the speaker hadn't said anything. So I want to make sure that I know that you said a lot there that I'm going to have to think about for a long time. One thing I've always been puzzled by is what could have possessed Carnap to think that the basic relation could be given a structural description in logic. At least as I understand logic, maybe as we understand logic, that just seems to be a non-starter. And hence you say, well, he invents a new logical term, foundedness for the purpose, and so on. But why could he have thought that was both important and possible? And then I want to ask exactly the opposite question. Would it have been enough to give a structural description of it that doesn't conform to our ordinary notions of logical expression or logical structure? Since the notion of logic seems to be somewhat fluid at the time, and what reason is there to think that there couldn't be one in some strange notion of logical description? I mean, he gives logical structure for color words and so on that I wouldn't have thought to be logical descriptions in the first place. And yet, over the years, I've become persuaded that, well, in a special sense of a logical structural description, yeah, he can do that. Maybe I'm similarly blind as to what he could do with the basic relation. End of plural questions, and they pull in different directions.
All right, I'll give it a shot. And thank you for your kind words at the start. What could have? Oh, I have to plug in. My computer is dying. Sorry, my computer was almost out of gas, so I had to switch positions. The trouble in answering philosophical questions is not knowing what is going to be satisfying in an answer. So I think there's a way in which what possesses him is to try to do this, to think that the key to the solution to objectivity is form, is that's what everything in the epistemological tradition that he's clearly working in, or traditions, is suggesting on the one hand, and it also seems to be what the methodology of physics is suggesting also. So that you get, you have the neo-Kantian account of the objectifying notion of form. You've got that story circulating amongst his friends in people like Reichenbach. You've got, but now with respect to details in the methodology of the exact sciences, you've got also the sort of Russellian influence, where what you can do is read things like Russell's own constructive projects in things like our knowledge of the external world as showing that logical form is sufficient to get you what you want for things like objects in the space-time world. So I think that sort of everything lines up, both technically and epistemologically, to suggest that that's got to be the project. What's interesting, I think, from my point of view, is the way in which it's pretty evident by the time he gets to the end that the official project isn't going to work. And foundedness is like the last refuge of something that might look phenomenological, right? In the Aufbau, because you get, it's an attempt to say this relation with this form is unique only within the field of experience. And then there's all this weird stuff about, we're going to depend on empirical theorems that are nonetheless theorems about the form of experience. So I think he's very confused actually about logic in the Aufbau. And I guess that, to then take it from the other direction, I think that he, there is an argument that foundedness is a logical notion in the work. It's a very weird argument, but it's suggestive of something. And I guess one of the things that's interesting about the Aufbau in particular for me is precisely the way in which Carnap is relying so much on logic, but he doesn't really know what he's talking about. He's got the Tractarian story sort of vaguely there. He confuses Frege with Hilbert in a weird way, which no one should do. Who's a student of Frege, that's in particular, should do. But he's working in type theory, but he says these, and then he, type theory plus foundedness. Anyway, I guess at this point, you might think he's still operating from the point of view that somehow structure is in the world. That's what the book says. And that you have to get that structure right. And the logic is the one that gets it right. But that's not a stable view of logic, and it's certainly not the one that he then will develop in the coming years. I don't know. That's my initial reaction, which is unsatisfying even to me.
Could I respond and ask a question to which I'm not even sure that my question makes sense, but in geometry, typically we construct lines and surfaces out of points and impose a kind of structure on that, but the basic elements are points. It is also possible, and Carnap knew that it was possible, and it was to be the fourth volume in the Principia by Whitehead, to construct points out of intervals and regions and so on. So in a sense, one can logically construct the elements of geometry, even though one has used those elements typically to construct the things out of which you're going to construct something else. That is, it's puzzling, but it is at least a sense in which what you had taken for granted as elements and out of which you're doing the construction can be itself constructed. It's sort of a snake eating its own tail sort of thing. Now, I'm not sure that that's terribly significant, but I don't think that would get him where he wants to go, but it gives a superficial impression of constructing the elements out of which one was doing the other constructions. So I'm not sure whether that, I don't think it's going to, I don't see how it's going to help in his overall project.
Yeah, I guess just to respond to that briefly, two things come to mind. One is, yeah, that construction is sort of, that construction of points out of intervals is sort of sketched in our knowledge of the external world, so Carnap would have had some idea of it. But it's not clear that that really does help you with Carnap's problem as he lands on it in the 150s in the Aufbau, because it's a different issue. It's like one has to do, I mean, he's already talked about the choice of the bases, right? And the multiple choices of the bases. But we've made our choice, but even when we've made that choice, we now have a different question, which is, can we purely structurally define away our own bases, right? Which is not what's happening in the Whiteheadian construction. The other thing that comes to mind, and something that I wish I understood better, is in the vicinity of what you're talking about is actually the way in which all of these people at this time, and certainly Carnap, and you can see it in the dissertation, is like deeply impressed by something in projective geometry about dualities and the ways in which theorems can be translated into theorems about different things. And maybe something out of that notion of construction and duality in projective geometry is behind the sensibility here. But how that works out is beyond my current technical abilities.
Christian, go. Christian? No. Christian, did you raise your hand?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
There seems to be an issue with the... okay. Yeah, so Alan, you cannot see me because there's an issue with my... with my camera, but I'm here. So the question is this, it's just a footnote to what you said about Fred Beiser's book, because I think you're completely right, of course, but what was crossing my mind is that there is a difference between these guys Beiser is mentioning, and that Carnap and also Reichenbach obviously didn't read, namely people like Lars and Jodl and Düring, and a bunch of other guys whom they read. And the difference is that I don't think that that it's so much a difference of opinion on fundamental philosophical topics, but the difference is that these guys, Jodl, Düring, and Lars, obviously didn't base their philosophical investigations in a substantial way on physics, on psychology, and mathematics. Whereas the guys whom Carnap actually read, and also Reichenbach, I guess, people like Mach and Avenarius and I don't know, a bunch of other, Helmholtz, of course, they all can also be seen as positivists of some sort, pretty much in the same way as Düring and Lars, etc. But difference is that they are what we call physicist philosophers, and I guess I mean it's just really a tiny footnote to what you said, because you said that what Carnap and Reichenbach are referring to is their scientific training rather than the German positivists. And I guess what one could add here is that there is like two different types of German positivists here. There is Lars and Düring and Jodl, and they are different from Mach and Avenarius and Helmholtz and the other guys. Not so much in their kind of fundamental views, but they are different in that they simply do not base their philosophy on psychology and physics in this substantial way in which it is done by them. And these guys obviously were read by Carnap and Reichenbach all the time. So it's just, I would say, basing their views on their scientific training doesn't rule out that they had a very strong connection to 19th century philosophy, which is in a sense positivism.
Yes, I think I would just grant all of that, and thank you for that. It is. I suppose that what comes out of that, yes, you're obviously right, and Carnap and the others are surely very well informed about people like Helmholtz, and sometimes through Mach. But yes, so I guess what one can then read Beiser's book in order to try to understand is the degree to which Beiser is perhaps suggesting that if those people, if the Mach, Avenarius, Helmholtz side is the only people that we attend to, then we're missing something important about the philosophical and especially the non-philosophy of science point of view that actually also informs German positivism. That might very well be an important fact about 19th century German positivism that we ought to attend to, but I don't think, as you're saying, that it actually speaks to the question of what's actually influencing these specific people that Friedman and others are talking about. Like, if what we're interested in is the Vienna Circle, it might very well be the case that we still will delimit our attention to people like Mach, Avenarius, and Helmholtz without loss, while still granting to Beiser that there's a further interesting story about positivism in its relations to things like social philosophy in the 19th century. I don't know.
Thanks.
Michael Stockner?
Yeah, it's a bit odd that I comment a book that I haven't read, but since Christian Damberg put the positivism into the game, I would fully agree with what I read. That was what Alan said. But my defense would be, well, look, Carnap is a sort of a younger generation who enter university when positivism by the Mach-Planck debate is basically in Germany understood as phenomenalism, and not, as Avenarius writes in a letter to Mach, I think 1902 or so, which you can find in the Mach archive, isn't it just rejection of metaphysics? But the older, so I think that would be my answer, because the older guys have read a book that I also read, namely Düring's Mechanics, which is a critical history of mechanics that's 10 years older than Mach. That's in the same year when Mach has this paper on the Erhaltung der Arbeit in the Lotusverein, so in the 70s. And the first edition is a pretty decent book. In the second edition, he offends everybody in Berlin, and then his venia is taken away for really constant offenses and a radical empiricist, the constructivist philosophy of mathematics. So if you're Neurath, and Neurath quotes during in his early history of optics book, then you have kind of a problem. But on the other hand, you read also Mach, and you see that you can do it in a way better. But Mach had studied the stuff himself, as one can see in the archives. So you read through all this original literature. So I think it's a bit it's just that this is a next generation where it's phenomenalism versus realism. And if you think that's a misunderstanding of positivism, you're correct. But I think that's basically what everybody agrees. And when Frank writes his sort of obituary on Mach in 1917, he also doesn't fight that anymore.
Again, I'm happy to just accept what you say. I guess we don't have Fred here to tell us what his intention is. I think that, I mean, I don't think what you said that goes against what I said in the talk, which is if what we need to know is something about a earlier and differently based philosophical rejection of the Kantian synthetic a priori. That's great, no doubt. There's many ways of rejecting the synthetic a priori. But that doesn't mean that those ways of rejecting the synthetic a priori are playing a crucial role in this very specific people that Friedman is talking about, which, in 1983 doesn't even include Neurath, right? So I think that's all I want to say at that point.
David?
Yeah, thanks. So I want to touch on the notion of objectivity in the Aufbau. As I understand it, one of the goals of the Aufbau is to construct a system of knowledge for science, and the plan is to take that basic relation, which is a ladder that eventually gets kicked away, and a bunch of given experiences, and to use these notions to define or construct the notions that are at play in regular scientific discourse. But at the same time, Carnap is tolerant of alternative systems of logic. He's tolerant of alternative ways of defining and constructing things. So my question is, where's the objectivity in this? I would take it that part of the goal of the empiricist project is to find some way of grounding objective knowledge in subjective experiences. But the construction itself for Carnap is entirely up to the speaker, the constructor, the definer. So Carnap constructs things one way, but somebody else might construct things a different way. And we can call these the resulting constructions objective, that the objectivity is found within the system itself. But it seems to me that this isn't the sort of objectivity that was motivating empiricists and even Kantians at the time. So my thought is that the epistemology that's to be found in the Aufbau is subjective. It's it seems to me that none of these constructions are literally correct for Carnap, that they are some kind of pragmatic adoption for whatever purpose that you have in doing science. So that where is the objective knowledge in the Aufbau? And if there is any objective knowledge, it's to be found, or if there's any knowledge at all to be found in the Aufbau, rather, it's to be found in that the immediate given of sense experience. Since the matter of construction is ultimately up to what the scientist finds useful, I find it difficult to believe that we get an objective system of knowledge as empiricists would conceive of it from this act of construction when we're tolerant of other constructions. So there is, I guess the conclusion is, it seems to me that there's no objective epistemology in the Aufbau at all, and I'm wondering where I've gone wrong in this.
Where have you gone wrong? I think one couple of things that I do want to say here is I think that you're you're extending beyond anything Carnap says the degrees of freedom here. He is a logical universalist. He thinks that he's not in the Aufbau saying you can choose any logic you want, because there are no other logics to choose from. So logical structure is set by type theory. Then he needs to have some sort of argument about why that is logic and other things aren't, but he does. And it's not the case that once you've chosen the basis, that everybody gets to do their constructions the way they want. The construction, the constitutional system without a psychological basis is dependent upon what he takes to be genuine. I mean, you can look at the construction, right? There are facts about the structure of the basic relation that are sort of directly logical, and then he also refers to things that he takes to be also facts about the structure of the basic relation, which are nonetheless empirically grounded, right? These so-called empirical theorems. But the empirical theorems better be the same for everybody, otherwise the construction doesn't get off the ground. So this is another place where you can begin to wonder, and my view of Carnap is he really, soon after the Aufbau, he understands the ways in which everything sort of mixed together in a weird way in the Aufbau. But it does require there is some requirement of a structure of experience which is the same for everyone, which is the ultimate sounds sort of Kantian. But for him, at least a good portion of that structure is based on empirical knowledge of the structure of the basic relation. But it can't be the case that you have a different structure in your experience than I do. And it can't be the case that you get to use a different logic than I do. Otherwise, the constitutional system is just an example of something and doesn't do it, as you say. If that were the case, it wouldn't do any of the work that Carnap says. I do think that Carnap ultimately would like you to think, one reason why he stopped talking about the Aufbau and hated it when people like Wilfrid Sellers wanted to talk to him about the Aufbau, is he really thinks that it's motivated by certain epistemological questions that genuinely don't make sense. That, for example, there is no such thing as the logical structure of experience, because that's not a place where logic is to be found. I think that's what I have to say on that right now.
Sorry, David, you're muted.
But surely Carnap is aware of alternative type theories, just like he's got to be aware of alternative set theories. Alternative set theories are a lot like the observations of Poincaré in geometry. We can do things another way, even using the tools of construction. There are other tools of construction. So, if that's what Carnap thought, that we have to take type theory as the system we use to construct our systems of knowledge, I'm wondering why he draws the line at there being one true type theory in this project.
Well, he does. That's my understanding, is that he gives arguments. And that it's the simple theory of types, and he thinks that there are, as it were, reasons in philosophical logic to think that things like ramification, in fact, don't make sense. But again, right, I think that as we read the Aufbau, and as we read back from the 1930s into the Aufbau, it's really quite clear that Carnap wants logic to do a lot of work for him. It wants to be a universalist about logic. There is the logic. But what he has to say about logic is really unconvincing and problematic, and stands in complicated relations that are unsatisfying to work that he was himself aware of. And this is part of the reason, because I haven't mentioned Michael Friedman's name in the question and answer period, this is part of the reason why Friedman wants to insist that there are these sensibilities about things in Carnap that you can see in the Aufbau, but are not given adequate expression in the Aufbau, so that you get to things like what you're saying only in logical syntax when he's become convinced that the whole question of what the logic is makes no sense. And then it becomes a practical question for any given purpose, which logic you're going to choose.
I see. Okay, yeah, there's a time delay in there that's that I wasn't respecting. Yeah, okay, I think that's where I went wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Alan. I also have a question. I would like to move on the objections against the Aufbau. And you mentioned Friedman's objection. And I would like to sort of asking for a comparison between Goodman's and Friedman's objections. And as I read in your book, your way to address Goodman's objection sort of embrace the same strategy that also Joel Proust and then also Thomas Morman adopted. So may I quote your book here, because I think it is very clear. So you said Goodman's particular concerns dissolve when we respect the constitutional difference between analysis and quasi-analysis. In cases of quasi-analysis, there is no external perspective against which to check the constructions for correctness. And this is exactly also Joel Proust's and then also Morman's way of arguing against Goodman. But so if we try to compare, I have worked on Goodman's objections and not on Friedman's objections. So I was curious to consider the opportunity to draw a comparison between Goodman's and Friedman's objection. And after this comparison, how does the way you address Goodman's objection may affect Friedman's objection to Carnap's Aufbau? This is my question.
Well, that's a complicated question. I guess it depends on what Friedman's objections are, but let me make a conjecture. So Friedman, I think, so one thing that Friedman wants to say is that the elimination of the basic relation doesn't work, right? And it doesn't work precisely because, for the reasons that Carnap attempts to smuggle foundedness in as a basic logical notion, namely, what Carnap tries to do is to say, now that we've got this entire constitutional system based on the basic relation, and details about the structure of the basic relation, we now want to say, oh, and the basic relation is the only relation that has that structure, therefore guaranteeing uniqueness, and therefore we're done. But based on things like permutations, we know that just take the field of the elementary experiences, and whatever the structure of the basic relation is, just swap them one for one with each other, the particular elementary experiences, you'll get a relation with the same structure. You can do all the same definitions on the basis of it, and therefore, but you're not going to get anything which is the objects of knowledge. But you don't have to. But it shows that it can't be the case that this is the only relation with the right structure, and that's just, as it were, guaranteed by type theory. And so I guess what seems to be I have to think about this more, but what seems to be different about it than what Goodman's worried about? Goodman's worried about, as it were, at the interface of logic and epistemology. Like, what if it turns out that our color experiences aren't like, for particular empirical reasons, aren't like what Carnap suggests, and then we can't get out, all of the color classes that Carnap needs. To which I think the answer is, yeah, right, that's true. But it turns out that it's not the case, right? Whereas for the elimination of the basic relation, Carnap himself is aware that much as he would like there to be only one relation over this field of objects that has this structure, his own logical system requires that that's not true. And that means that he can't get the uniqueness out unless he somehow changes the logical basis. And that's why he needs there to be foundedness as a way of specifying that it's this relation and not the other ones that have the same structure. But that's exactly to beg the question, or to fail to do what you said that you were going to do. And I think really this objection is devastating to the project, unless, as Rick says, and as maybe David was suggesting, we have some way of saying, nonetheless, type theory plus foundedness is logic. It's the logic of empirical science. It's not the logic that we need for the formal sciences. Again, I'm sure that there's much more that needs to be said in response to your question.
Sorry, I was curious because I was just even curious to consider the opportunity that the strategy that you, Mormon, and Proust adopt may also downplay somehow Friedman's objection in the case we read it in terms of the uniqueness of the reconstruction of the basic relation. But this is just, I've never made a research precisely on Friedman's objection. But I think your strategy against Goodman is very powerful. And I was just wondering if it may also downplay a kind of objection like Friedman's in terms of the uniqueness. But this is just an open consideration.
Yeah, well, as I said, I need to think more about this. I think I can begin to understand what you're saying. So one way that you might want to read those sections in the 150s where he does the project of the elimination of the basic relation. Well, one thing you might suggest instead of doing that would be to say something more like, instead of trying to claim that RS is the only relation that has this structure, which requires him to add foundedness, you might want to say the way to understand the project of constitution is it's based on the one relation that, as a matter of fact, is in experience and has that structure. And it's, as it were, an experiential matter of fact that there's only one relation that has that structure, and that's sufficient. Carnap, and I guess it's more grist for my mill, which is, I think Carnap has a fundamental belief that the objective-subjective distinction is the crucial epistemological distinction in the Aufbau. That's the one that needs to be made sense of. We have to show that how objective knowledge is possible in the sciences. And I think he has a whole bunch of slightly different ways of making out the objective-subjective distinction, which then there are various places in the book where you can find those things having been done. And then he remembers, oh, but I also have this other one. And you know, the construction of the intersubjective world, which would seem like it would be enough, actually doesn't fulfill what I said in section 16. So now we have to go back and do that. And I think it's just like a completely confused sort of, it's like he's got many different, slightly different versions of this distinction, and he's trying to fulfill them all in the Aufbau, and there's no univocal way to present the lesson about objectivity once you have them all.
Thank you very much, Alan, for answering my question. And are there any other questions? Otherwise, we are running already out of time. Any follow-ups? Nothing? Okay. So, Alan, thank you very much. It was a great talk and event for us, and I want to thank all the participants, both the speakers and the audience. It has been a wonderful year for me organizing this seminar, and we will have another edition in 2026, and we will be in touch for all the information. But first of all, thank you very much for the esteemed speaker that have accepted my invitation to this Reconstructing Carnap webinar series. It was really great. Thank you.
And thank you. And I'll see some of you in.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Katerina.
Ciao.
Bye, Katerina.
Bye.
Bye.